Welcome to another presentation from SR Snodgrass as part of our ongoing podcast series. Kaitlyn Gasper, welcome back to the podcast today. It's great to have you here.
Great. Thanks for having me back.
So one quick thing to note here is that you had a recent promotion to principal in our risk advisory. It's great to hear of that and to welcome you to our senior leadership team and excited to see what you do in that position.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm excited as well.
So today, though, we're taking a little bit of a deeper dive into Bank Secrecy Act, BSA, specifically model validations, right?
Correct.
So let's first talk about who we are trying to address today. Who's our audience?
Sure. So our audience isn't limited to just BSA personnel. This also is geared towards management at the board level, audit committee level, those who are making decisions in whether or not they're going to use or implement a model, and also then model risk management from a monitoring standpoint after the model has been implemented.
So it's really widespread because this is a topic that's not just for those, as you mentioned, that are doing the BSA, but also throughout the bank, including boards, making sure that it's giving the due diligence, so to speak,
Sure.
and attention that it needs.
Yes.
So today, what are we going to get into that's a little bit different from our last podcast then? A little deeper dive. Do you want to kind of hit on some of those areas that we're going to talk about?
Yeah. So last time we just briefly touched on BSA model validations. This podcast is more specific to why the model validations are important. What are some common issues that we identify? What are examiner expectations? Kind of what do we see that's going on at the institutions that we're performing these validations? So it's a lot more deeper of a dive on, how the models are being used and then the validations being performed.
Okay, that sounds great then. So as we start talking about the topics, let's kind of also highlight why not only you, but Snodgrass in general too, why we're qualified to talk about this topic. Some
Sure.
expertise at hand here. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. At Snodgrass within the risk advisory, we have a lot of BSA experts. We also have individuals that are certified anti-money laundering specialists, so that hold the CAM certification. So we have a lot of individuals who are familiar with BSA, have performed audits, been involved in the validation, implementation, and the actual execution of the validation. So, we're familiar with the different models. We've worked with different core systems and varying institution sizes as well, from asset sizes of a couple $100 million to a multi-billion.
So wide ranging there as far as expertise goes, and not just with one model validation, but multiple as well too. So let's start talking a little bit about, you had mentioned a little bit about why and the differences. So let's first address the difference between a BSA audit as well as, the model validation. What's the differences between the two?
Sure. So BSA as a whole it's really in place to ensure that financial institutions are preventing and detecting money laundering and any, financing of terrorism that could flow through the institution. So on the audit side, we're really focusing on the controls that are in place and testing those, making sure that they have the right reporting they're addressing the right reporting requirements, record keeping controls, really testing the actual controls that are set up and ensuring that management has those processes in place. So it has nothing to do with a model that's being used. It's more so how is the bank complying with BSA as a whole to ensure that suspicious activity, money laundering is not occurring at their institution.
So then the model validation takes it a little bit further then, correct? Does it try to help automate some of the systems and processes? Because with a lot of transactions, it's hard to manually do what needs done then, correct?
Correct. Yes. So it is automating. It's a data-driven tool. The model is used to kind of take that customer data and analyze it and then look for any patterns or trends that deviate from normal activity. So the model validation, we're more so focusing on what's being input into the model and is it functioning as intended based on that data that's being fed into the model used.
So let's move into the difference now between the third-party model validation with that. How does that differ too?
Sure. So the third-party model validation, that is specific to the mathematical accuracy of the model. So that's going to be on that proprietary information, just confirming that the model as a whole functions, whereas we're coming in and performing a validation, and it's specific to the bank's usage of the model. So we're looking at the individual data that they're inputting versus what the outputs are, where a third-party model validation is looking at the mathematical accuracy, the calculations, the algorithms, the behind the scenes information that we're not touching on in our validations.
Okay, that makes sense then. Thank you for clearing that up and giving some additional information. So let's talk a little bit about, if someone has never had this part done, the model validations, if they're new to that, who needs to do that? How often do they need to do it? How do they even start doing that?
Sure. So it is best and it is important. And if you go through the supervisory guidance, it's very important to have somebody that's considered an expert or have the expertise to perform a model validation. So a lot of times institutions maybe want to start out and perform testing in-house, which can be very difficult and, kind of cross the lines of independence if you're involved in the BSA area, as well as just having knowledge to do so within the model. So I think it's really important that you make sure that you have somebody who has knowledge of models and how they work in the validation process. So it really is kind of driven by, I would say, BSA management first, making sure that they have that process in place, but also whatever governance in the bank, if there's risk management or someone overseeing models as a whole, not just limited to BSA, model risk management is important to ensure that you are touching on that validation piece of the models that are being used.
And then if they've never done this before, how do they even get started? Do they know, is there regulatory guidance as far as when you need to start doing this?
So there's regulatory guidance. It's not explicit. It doesn't explicitly state when you need to begin to do that. We always like to say that we need at least 6 months worth of data to perform the model validation, because in order to go through and test that, alerts are being generated, customer risk ratings are accurate, we need some data to work with there. So we kind of use the best practice rule of thumb of 6 months implementation at least. The guidance does not say what the time frame that it has to be, but you need at least some data to work with there.
That makes sense.
In terms of periodic or subsequent validations, the guidance also isn't explicitly clear on that as well. We typically see it. We can see it from the 3 to 5 year range. I would say majority of our clients, they're kind of in between that 1 to 3 year range. So depending on complexity and size, they may get a validation annually, maybe every other year or every 3 years. It really depends. Also depends on how many issues were identified in that initial validation.
What kind of issues do you typically see with that too?
Yeah, so in validations, the big thing is, one of the bigger things, it's model setup. So the data that's being fed into the model essentially is going to be what is used for identifying potentially suspicious activity. We run into a lot of issues with mapping of that data. So not only, on the customer level, but as well as the transaction level. So making sure that transaction codes are mapped properly and being pulled into the model, making sure that customer data or information is pulling in properly, because one of the key components that our institutions use the model for is customer risk rating and customer due diligence. And in order to kind of set up those risk factors, the customer data has to pull over properly to risk rate and align with the bank's overall risk profile.
So you were talking about the model, the data going into the model. What about it coming out then too? Because I'm sure that, sometimes what you intend to test isn't always what you end up getting, and relying on that as well. Do you evaluate that part as well too? Do you see that a lot of banks have issues with that too? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Our validations, we focus on 3 components. So we look at the input component, the processing component, so how the data is being transmitted, and then the outputs. So we are looking at, how it flows from start to finish. On the output side of things, we're looking at, alert generation. We're doing a reconcilement of transactions. So we're making sure that those are being pulled in and then set up to go to, whatever alerts are being generated. So we certainly are focusing on that. The reports that are being generated or used by management within the model to confirm that those are accurate. So yes, we do identify issues. Typically, the outputs are not the issue because they're based on the data that was input into the model. So it really starts as long as you have the correct data going into the model, the outputs typically function as intended, just based on that mathematical accuracy validation that's being performed by a third-party vendor of the model in itself.
So what's your recommendation with identifying the data going in, if that needs to change?
Mm-hmm.
documentation, I'm guessing, is really important to that.
Yeah, it's really important. So if you were to change anything in the model, changing any parameters, or even accepting defaults, because a lot of times you'll get these models and they'll say, well, our peers or institutions and similar size as you kind of use these parameters need to go through and make sure, does this fit our institution's risk profile? If you were to change anything or even accept the defaults, that should be documented to explain or provide rationale as to why you've accepted those or made those changes. In addition, if you are making changes, we always look or at least recommend that some form of back testing is performed. So once you've made the change, tracking it, having your proper approvals and documentation, and then after a certain time frame, depending on the change made, going back and testing to make sure that the change made was actually what was intended.
Do you find that those inputs need to change regularly, or as a financial institution increases in size, or what makes them want to change that after everything's been set up?
Yeah, so input specific to the data being input does change frequently. That can be if a new product or service is introduced to the bank and there's a transaction code. You'll want to make sure that is mapped properly and that is being captured if it is an area that could be heightened for suspicious activity. In terms of parameters, those change as well. So if we're looking at it from like an alert parameter of alerting the bank of any potential suspicious activity, those change depending on what is currently going on in the economy, what changes are happening. There were a lot when we had COVID and there were things going on with unemployment or say PPP fraud. You were able to tailor alerts to kind of look for keywords in those areas. So depending on what's going on, yes, BSA is ever changing. So I would say those parameters will change as the bank's risk profile changes. If they go into different geographic locations, if they have different products or services, those could change.
That's nice to know that it can be that customized as well as staying up to date with everything too. Yes. And I think it's just important to make sure, as with most things within financial institutions, it's not a one and done type of deal. Correct. It's always monitoring and being aware of what else it can do and help with as well too.
Yes.
Kaitlyn, let's now talk about the examiners. What are they expecting when they're doing their examination of the BSA model validations?
Sure. So examiners, and I think we touched on it a little bit with the common issues. We see a lot of examiners make comments on, accepting or making parameter changes to ensure that documentation exists. A lot of the issues too that we're seeing with our examiners surrounds the CDD, so the customer due diligence, and then the enhanced due diligence and customer risk rating. So really ensuring that you are going in and whatever risk factors are being used. So if you went from a manual process to the model, or if you've been using model to model, making sure that those risk factors align with the bank's overall risk profile. So, what areas, what do you consider would elevate the customer's risk rating, and ensuring that you've gone through and that it makes sense for your institution and you have that documentation. So we see a lot of issues with that. I think also a common issue is that the validation wasn't performed. So just making sure, and I think you touched on this on, when does a validation need to be performed? And I think that's kind of where a gray area as well. So when people implement their model, they're not necessarily thinking 6 months, I need to get a validation or so. So we see a lot of comments on that, but an examiner certainly is looking for somebody with that expertise to perform a validation on the models.
I have to say that your expertise on this subject is apparent. And I'm guessing too that you're able to help our clients when they need to go through this process so that they can get that clean report from the examination too. So if they want to learn more and get into more specific information about what they are facing, recommendations as to how they can reach out to you.
Sure. So they can reach out to me through our website or in the email that's listed below the podcast here. Can also reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Thank you so much for being here and coming back to the podcast to talk to everyone a little bit more about the BSA model validations. Thanks, Kaitlyn.
Thanks.
At SR Snodgrass, we're always growing. We have offices in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Ohio, and West Virginia. Whether you're entry level, senior level, or somewhere in between, we invite you to check us out. Go to our website at www.srsnodgrass.com, follow us on LinkedIn, and join us on our quest for the best.